Good morning, everyone. What a very special occasion it is for me as the Data Protection Commissioner for Ireland to give this opening keynote at the inaugural Irish Government Data Summit. As was mentioned earlier, the government in 2014 appointed the first Data Protection Minister in Europe, and Darragh Murphy, as that minister, has brought a whole new energy and focus to the critical debate around the issues of technology and individual identity. And he and his team at the Department of the Taoiseach and the Government Data Forum, as he mentioned earlier, have been the driving force behind the fantastic programme we have before us for the next 2 days. Because data is, after all, everywhere and everything in today's world. And it's both a pleasure and a very useful opportunity for me and my team at the Irish Data Protection Authority, many of whom are here with me today, to engage with so many key stakeholders and experts here at this event. And I'm delighted that so many of you could come to Dublin to drive forward that conversation on how we each play a role in shaping the norms and values we want to underpin the regulation of data-driven technologies today and tomorrow. Not surprisingly, my short talk this morning is going to touch on the new EU General Data Protection Regulation, which will come into force, of course, at the end of May 2018, or GDPR, as I will more frequently abbreviate it. But the key word for my talk today is going to be context, and why it really is king in understanding the implications of data protection law. It's certainly the case, as Mark outlined earlier, that we live in interesting times fueled in part by the fact that we're all agents of a digital revolution now that's driving change in our economies, our societies, and our political environments at an unprecedented pace, and change that's well beyond the velocity of the previous global industrial revolutions. That's what marks it out. In recent years, with the onslaught of social media in particular, we've seen a myriad of new challenges arise, and Mark mentioned some of these earlier: cyberbullying, revenge porn, children suing their parents for posting their baby pictures online, fake news, online radicalization, thumb injuries from using touchscreens, time wasting arising from watching videos of cats on YouTube, global cyber systems vulnerabilities exploited by the likes of WannaCry, marital discord from social media addictions, and so on and so on, a whole vocabulary we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. And we could make a long, long list. But equally, we see the significant benefits of technology too. Far fewer people across the world now live in extreme poverty, substantially helped by the links that technology and globalization have brought to people all over the world, albeit with continuing problems in the distribution of that wealth. And we can all think of fantastically positive examples of what data-driven technologies in particular have given us: better understanding of climate change, how to combat hospital infections, identification of genetic markers linked to cancer. And on an individual consumer level, I've often heard, for example, people with disabilities talk about the huge independence and improvement to the quality of their life internet technologies have given them. And for those of us with relatives spread across the globe, we can keep an easy contact using over-the-top call services. But one of the things it seems to me that the democratization of publishing in particular through social media has led to is something of a diminution of the status of real expertise, and consequently to a loss of nuance in debate. Individuals tend to increasingly cast themselves on very extreme sides of a debate: pro-Remain versus pro-Leave, pro-left versus pro-right, pro-technology versus pro-privacy. And this really brings me to the crux of what I want to talk to you about today. What we have to understand clearly is that in the world of data protection and technology, it is context that's king. With a largely principles-based law, it can't be automatically black or white, left or right, innovation or privacy. First of all, however, as this is a broad-based audience that's here today, I think it would be useful if I briefly explain the role of data protection authorities. We're responsible for supervising all types of public and private sector bodies in terms of how they collect and process specifically personal data. And personal data is information about you. It's your name, your phone number, your email address, your purchasing records, your health records, anything that is specific to you as an identifiable individual. It can be your IP address in certain circumstances. And it's worth reminding ourselves, I think always, of the simplicity and actual common sense nature of what data protection principles require organizations to do in handling the data of individuals. The principles require that information is obtained fairly, where organizations give notice to individuals of what personal data they're collecting and why. They use the data only for the specified purposes, keep it safe, secure, and up to date, including it not disclosing it to unauthorized third parties. They retain it for only as long as necessary and give a copy to an individual who requests a copy of their data. And yet, perhaps, of all the problems of the internet era, it is the issue of maintaining control over our digital identity and controlling how we are tracked and monitored that are amongst the most fundamental issues for us as human beings. American lawyers Warren and Brandeis, said to be the founding fathers of what they described as the right to be let alone, they would surely shake their heads in disbelief if they saw our globally connected world, and they'd be stunned to discover that the portable camera they were so affronted by in 1890 is now an anywhere, anytime recording device carried by a majority of adults and teenagers in the Western world. It's a world where inferences can be drawn about us unbeknownst, and where the price we pay for goods changes as we shop online based on an algorithm that calculates how urgent our need is and what we might be willing to pay based on a profile of our internet usage. And in all of this, data protection authorities have a watchdog role where we identify risks in terms of how data is collected and used. For example, to give a local example, we recently audited a number of insurance companies in Ireland that are offering new products based on drivers agreeing to use telematic apps that monitor their driving behaviour. And we also then handle and investigate complaints from individual members of the public who consider that their personal data has been mistreated by organisations. And in Europe, of course, I think we all know this, each individual under the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 8, enjoys a specific right to have their personal data protected. So let me revert to the points I made earlier about binary arguments of technology good versus bad, or technology versus privacy, and examine these in the light of context. So think of an example of genetic testing. I think we could all probably agree that in appropriate clinical settings with regulated professionals, ethics committees, and counsellors, genetic testing and research could be a good thing where it leads to identification of markers for breast cancer, as an example. In these types of regulated clinical environments, ethical decisions can be made on what information patients should receive, whether the rest of the family should receive certain results where they could be equally affected by what's identified, whether DNA samples should be destroyed, and whether the data can be safely stored in the cloud, etc. But then think of genetic testing in the context of online commercial firms offering, for example, child talent genetic testing. Yes, indeed, this is a test that purports to tell you whether it's a good idea to buy your child a piano or not, and claims to give you a firm idea of your child's strengths and weaknesses. A lot of the websites offering these types of online services fail to outline the privacy implications with this type of test, precisely what data is collected, how the data would be used, if it would be sold on to third parties, how it would be secured, and where it would be stored. Neither typically are these websites clear that, in fact, no DNA test is going to be accurate in terms of predicting if a child is going to be good at playing the piano or not, or in relation to any of the personality traits of a child. Genetic data also presents the privacy complication of family members being identifiable as well. So it's not that we can say categorically that genetic testing is a positive use of personal data and doesn't violate data protection laws. Context coupled with compliant implementation are everything in this scenario. And on that point, it's of course the case that child talent genetic testing offered over the internet could conceivably be implemented in compliance with data protection laws. And data protection laws can't otherwise decide on the ethics of such an offering. And similarly, you could have genetic testing in a clinical environment poorly implemented that fails in compliance. So context is king, but correct implementation by the same token must always be a given. I know there are many public sector bodies here today, and I've said it on a number of occasions before, but many public sector bodies do seem to struggle enormously with the high-level principles-based nature of data protection law. And frequently they might visit my office and ask me a question like the following, and I underline this is a purely fictional example. They might ask me, can we roll out a program of requiring every human in Ireland to swallow an ingestible sensor, wear a patch on their wrist that would pick up its signal and transfer the data via Bluetooth to a government database? And when I ask for details of the purpose of the project, the legal basis for the collection, the necessity for this level of interference with privacy rights, the less privacy-invasive alternatives considered, the results of the privacy impact assessment conducted, the safeguards proposed, it can often draw a blank. So when I go on to explain then the type of analysis that would be necessary for a public body to conduct and give guidance on how that analysis might be conducted, they will listen politely and then ask me at the end, but can we do that project with the ingestible sensors? In other words, there can be a reluctance about stepping through the detailed and contextual analysis that's necessary in every single case. In this type of scenario, my office might typically then hear back that the public body has said, oh, the Data Protection Commissioner doesn't like ingestible sensors, so we can't do that project. But I hope I can make clear that data protection commissioners don't make policy choices, and we're not here to like or dislike any technologies or policies. Our role is to ensure that appropriate data privacy analysis has been conducted so that any such measure can be lawfully implemented. And there's no book that tells us the answer to any data protection implementation question. It hangs off the detail in every specific case. And the organization proposing it is best placed to conduct that analysis in the first instance. And context counts for all of us too individually in terms of the privacy choices we have to make. I think some of you here will be familiar with the American cryptographer Bruce Schneier. He's visited Dublin a number of times, and he's the author of many highly regarded books on data security and privacy, and talks a lot about the issues of modern internet technologies. In particular, he talks a lot about monitoring and tracking by private corporations and government surveillance. And he cites surveillance as both a political and legal problem, which needs to be tackled on both of those fronts. But I was particularly interested in the chapter in his Data and Goliath book, where he talks about what we should each be doing ourselves in order to avoid being subject to surveillance, in particular online. So he makes suggestions like we should pay in cash rather than with our credit cards, alter our driving routes to avoid traffic cameras, leave our smartphone at home, use DuckDuckGo for internet searches, keep cash transactions below a certain threshold to avoid triggering notification to financial regulators, encrypt our data, refrain from posting identifying details on public sites, turn off location services on our smartphone, put a sticker over your computer's camera, dress in drag is one of his suggestions, swap loyalty cards with your neighbors, enter random information onto web forms, avoid doing online surveys, search for complete strangers on Facebook to confuse it about who you really know, and so on. He's a lot of suggestions. And he's not been ironic or comedic in any of those that he proposes. And in fact, he acknowledges that there would be huge social, time, and monetary costs for any of us in operating in this way and implementing all of those measures, not to mention a psychological burden of total paranoia if you take it too far. But I do think his list is useful in terms of tuning us into the internet world in which we live and what our level of choice is, and sometimes how stark that level of choice is. So the world and the choices we get to make have certainly changed, and our relationship with how we manage our identity has had to change too. And it's not really a matter, as many people ask, of asking, well, is privacy dead with the internet? But really, how has it changed? It's pretty much impossible for any of us now to live without generating a digital footprint and being subject to some form of tracking. But as Bruce Schneier advises us all, we have to each individually think about it and identify our own sweet spot and decide what trade-offs in terms of personal data and a service we're willing to make. And finally, this brings me to the GDPR and its importance in terms of allowing all of us better understand our choices with regard to personal data and indeed, in some cases, drive better choices for us. The EU Commission is seeking to ensure the protection of rights of Europeans, in particular their Article 8 Charter right to have their personal data protected in proposing the GDPR. But it's also trying to promote and strengthen the EU digital economy. And it knows that this can only be achieved where consumers have trust in online services, whether public or private, with which they engage. So rather than being mutually exclusive, data protection law and the strengthening of the digital economy are complementary. And I believe that the GDPR is going to slowly transform our relationship with digital service providers of all types. And yes, of course, the new law is based on the same data protection principles with which we're already familiar, but its real strength lies in the new accountability and transparency requirements that it implements. These will drive the most significant new behaviours by organisations and by data subjects. The very simple idea now that organisations must know the personal data processing operations for which they're responsible and will have to document them and do due diligence on the legal basis for the collection, processing and retention is a really genius innovation in the law because it's simple and it's going to be revolutionary in compliance terms and revelatory to many boards of organisations. Other requirements such as appointing a data protection officer, reporting breaches on a mandatory basis to data protection authorities. In cases of new technology implementation, there will be a requirement to conduct a mandatory data protection impact assessment. These will all drive data protection as a central compliance activity in organisations. The requirements to demonstrate data minimisation, privacy by design and default will force organisations now to step carefully through the analysis that must be done. And the notice requirements to users, the transparency requirements under Articles 13 and 14 of the GDPR, these should ensure that we see the back of obscure privacy policies buried within other terms and conditions of service that talk in opaque language about things like potential sharing of data with affiliates and so on, which none of us understand. So the new concise and intelligible notice we will receive will allow us to decide if Bruce Schneier's suggestions on how to protect our data privacy are actually quite reasonable in the circumstances. At the moment, we don't often have a clear picture of what's being collected in order to understand the risks of signing up, for example, to an app or not. The GDPR recognises a risk-based approach to implementation, reflective of that fact that context is all important in terms of an analysis of the risks for data subject and the mitigation measures that should be taken in any given scenario. And all of these new transparency requirements in the law, we hope will drive the development of a new market of data privacy differentiation, where companies that can distinguish their product or service by their privacy offering will start to win. And best of all, the GDPR has extraterritorial reach, so any online company targeting sales or services at European users is caught in its net. The GDPR is going to change then global behaviours and drive new global standards. And of course, the only reason data protection compliance is going to become a matter of board-level interest across the board now is because of the sanctions and fines in the GDPR. As a data protection authority supervising the world's largest internet companies from Dublin, we're very pleased to see our enforcement toolkit being expanded massively by the EU to allow us to implement punitive sanctions if and where warranted. As a supervisory authority, we've been preparing our transformation now for the last 2 years. The Minister mentioned that our budget has been quadrupled by government since 2014. We've close to trebled our staffing numbers, up to 70 staff now in situ. We'll have about 100 by the end of this year. We're currently recruiting. We've already hired in specialists in legal, technical, investigative and communications fields. We've particularly ramped up our awareness and outreach programs considerably in the last 6 months, and most recently with the launch of a new microsite at gdpr.and.eu.ie to drive awareness and then preparation for the GDPR. We've also got a booth today down on the ground floor in the forum room, so we'd be delighted if any of you would call by. I said at the outset we live in interesting times, in part because of the pace of change this current industrial revolution imposes on us. The pace is only going to accelerate as we move closer to a merging of the biological and technological in mainstream artificial intelligence applications, where learning algorithms will dictate the future. The GDPR recognizes the potential of innovation and technology, but it simply demands that it's done in a responsible way, where there's accountability and transparency about the implications for each of us in controlling our identities and access to our personal data. The GDPR can't and won't solve all of the issues our internet world is throwing up. Other laws will be needed in certain areas to regulate some of these other aspects. But the GDPR, we believe, is overall going to make the world a better place. And at the Irish Data Protection Authority, we're getting ready and fully determined to play our part in enforcing that new order. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.